This week in class, we're thinking about the fairy tale as a literary form, and kind of thinking about adaptations of the fairy tale in contemporary literature. So we're reading some of Angela Carter's works here, and we're going to kind of think about the constituent parts of the fairy tale as a literary genre. First of all, there's a definite question when you think about the fairy tale, whether the fairy tale is an oral tale that's been told and passed along through the orality of cultures, and what happens to the fairy tale when it becomes a written form. So here you kind of think about the difference between reading Disney's Cinderella in a child's book versus watching that on film versus having the story told to you by a grandparent here. So you can think about whether or not what happens if you think about Carter's tales as oral tales that have been written down. Does that change the way that you read them? Also, here we can kind of think about the distinctions of literary genres. The more kind of generic term folk tales, of which fairy tales are, but how does the fairy tale differ as a means of storytelling from a fable or a legend or urban legend or a myth? And do we still have these things in contemporary culture? We're going to also look at the idea of the myth in contemporary culture. But legend still exists, and how do we think about urban legends as a distinct form of storytelling, or do we have kind of more contemporary versions of legend that arise from web culture or from the ways in which we engage the internet? Are there such things as internet legends that have developed as a storytale form? And also here we can think about the other contemporary retellings or reinventions of the fairy tale. So what happens when Disney makes Cinderella? How does the kind of magic of the fairy tale get impacted by a Disneyfied or commercialized version of the fairy tale itself as the princesses emerge in Disney's telling? Basic elements of the fairy tale as a form. The fairy tale invokes a fantastic, magical, or kind of unreal world in a way. Rather than realistic characters, you have archetypal or dreamlike figures who move through the story. Classic figures, as we'll see in Carter's tales, the werewolf, the witch, the young child. These are not real figures, but are kind of drawn out of dream world or fantastic world. There's a suspension of cause and effect within the plotting. Magic works in the fairy tale. Strange things happen. Weird things happen sometimes. And there are clear moral distinctions within the fairy tale generally, that there are heroic characters, there are villainous characters, and there are not many in between, that characters act upon clear moral causes and try to affect a more moral space in the tale. There's a mood of wonder that gets invoked in fairy tales as well. There's kind of an innocence that attaches itself to the main character who's kind of moving through the world and discovering this world. But there's also that space of innocence can also be a psychological space where the tale is working out some root conflicts within the culture, within the individual psyche, so that space of wonder permits that psychological working out as the story unwinds. And there's also a timeless setting to the fairy tale, right? A classic fairy tale begins once upon a time, right? That there's a kind of detached timelessness in which the tale happens, and the tale wraps up, and they all lived happily ever after in the classic formulation of it, right? That everything resolves itself in the fairy tale, that there is an ending to the fairy tale that kind of squares off a sense of moral purpose and cause and effect in the end. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber disarranges those kind of classic elements in some ways, and we'll look at that in just a second. But when it was published in 1979, Carter in a later interview said that her purpose was not to do versions of classic fairy tales, but to extract the latent content from traditional tales. So how do fairy tales content kind of engage root conflicts within the cultures in which they arose and within our own cultures. Why are we still attached to telling fairy tales? Why are we still engaged with Once Upon a Time and Happily Ever After? Why is it that Disney, is able to run out another version of the princess story and make plenty of bank on it? So the fairy tale is a literary genre that still has a lot of power. And so Carter, when she rewrites these tales in the 1970s, she's kind of rethinking what is the power of the fairy tale as a literary form. And so Carter will kind of adapt some basic elements, some basic fictional elements as she retells these stories. As she tries to, as she says, extract that latent content. She's going to think about how those basic archetypes, those very kind of flat figures, the witch, the werewolf, the good child, right? How do they reflect psychological conflicts within our culture? Why are we still engaged with those very kind of flat character types in our storytelling? She's also going to think about the impact of the Gothic feel of fairy tales, that kind of mood of wonder. She's going to introduce moral ambiguities to that, though, and think about how the Gothic has moral ambiguities embedded in it from the very beginning. And this is in distinction to the kind of heroic flat figures that appear in the classic fairy tales that we're told as children. Also, she's going to explore some feminist elements or motifs. So she's going to examine the female characters within the tales and kind of think about what happens if you give them more agency within the story itself. Carter's voice is also very distinctive here, right? She's going to disrupt that sense of timelessness in ways that modern world is going to intrude in the ways that she tells her stories, as well as in the means in which the stories kind of work themselves out. So an example here that you've read is from The Lady of the House of Love, the British soldier who comes in on his way to World War I in the trenches, but he is definitely a citizen of the modern world. What happens when you put him in engagement with that older Gothic vampiric world of the young woman in the house here? Also, Carter will close the distance within point of view. The classic fairy tale is told in a more distant third person, where it's he, she, and it is narrated. Carter, though, is going to make that a little closer to, is going to move the narration a little closer to one of the characters, perhaps, or even adopt a first-person narration. So an example here that you've read is from The Tiger's Bride, where you have an I narrator who's going to tell her own story in that version and kind of explore her sense of agency after she's lost in a game of cards by her father. So that adaptation of point of view is an important part of Carter's retelling. And she's also going to play with plotting in her tales, right? That she's going to compress stories down to basic elements. For those of you who worked through The Snow Child saw that. She's going to mix elements of tales. So tales are going to kind of crash into each other here. And she's going to tell some variations on tales. So you have a couple different versions of Red Riding Hood in the Bloody Chamber. You have the version that we're looking at, the werewolf here, and also the version of the Company of Wolves. And how you can think about how different Red is as a character in those. In the Company of Wolves, she seduces the werewolf woodsman at the end of the tale, and in the werewolf, we have quite a different ending from that. So there's going to be shifts within the endings of these kind of classic tales. And in an example, in another story you're looking at here is The Bloody Chamber, which ends with the narrator's mother heroically appearing and shooting the Bluebeard figure in the head. If you haven't read this story, I'm sorry for ruining the end, but her heroic appearance at the end is quite striking. If you read The Werewolf as a fairy tale here, you notice the various elements that mark it as a fairy tale from the very beginning, right? It's a fantastic setting. Carter opens the tale. It is a northern country. They have cold hearts and harsh, brief, poor lives. So she distinguishes her world and our world from the world of the story, right? It's a distant place. It's Once Upon a Time is kind of invoked in that opening. There's a suspension of the ordinary cause and effect of our world as well. As she writes, to these upland woodsmen, the devil is as real as you or I. So this is going to be a world of fantastic creatures, a world of magic versus the ordinary sense of cause and effect and modern physics that we dwell in. Carter's voice also kind of closes the point of view here. This is told in third person, but there's an I that kind of, is underneath it. The narrator is a part of the story in some ways, as she commands Red in the tale, "Go and visit grandmother, take her the oat cakes I've baked for her." And so, there's a closeness to the story that Carter wants to get out. Is sometimes lacking in the classic formulations of Red Riding Hood. You have a series of fantastic beings as well in the story. You have the witch, the good child who carries a knife. You might note here, right? You have the wolf, and so these are classic literary childlike story figures who appear again and again in various instantiations. That you're familiar with them from the beginning as a reader. When you think about plotting in the Werewolf, you note various things as well. You have a mixing of tales, right? There's that sense of a Little Red Riding Hood here, but is that Little Red Riding Hood one that you expect as a reader, right? She carries a knife. She's willing to enact violence to defend herself, and what is her position at the end of the story? When the wolf appears, she slashes off its right forepaw, where the wolf lets out a gulp, almost a sob. And so, do you feel sorry for the wolf in that particular moment, or versus the regular tale where the wolf is villainous? Is there a moment here where the wolf becomes a figure of your empathy or sympathy here? The wolf's paw fell to the floor, but it was no longer a wolf's paw; it was a hand. And so here you see, the classic villain, the wolf, humanized very directly by Carter's telling. And then you think about, in terms of the plot, how the neighbors respond, to the realization that, the grandmother is a witch, that they take her out into the woods and beat her to death, when they recognize that she, that she is a witch, how they respond to the tale. So how you respond to Red's own violence here is an important part of the kind of play that Carter is developing in the story. And how she engages that, what she called latent content, right? There's a classic resolution to the classic fairy tale, right? That they all lived happily ever after. But do you get that in Carter's retelling of the tale here, right? You get grandmother's identity as a witch, her execution at the hands of the townspeople. Is that happily ever after? Versus the child who now lives in her grandmother's house, she prospered. Is that the same as happily ever after? So Carter here is kind of complicating that sense of the happy ending of the fairy tale. All these elements work together in Angela Carter's retelling of the fairy tale. You can read for these and for these elements and for others as you look at the stories this week. It'll be interesting to see how you see the fairy tale elements within them. Thanks.